So my name is Belinda. I am doing my PhD in cognitive psychology. So we look at all the different influences on people's decision making and their behaviour. Today I'm going to talk about a project where we looked at all the different influences on people's climate change related beliefs and behaviour. So we used a national survey of Australians to identify the most important social and psychological predictors in terms of how concerned Australians are about climate change and how willing they are to do something about it. So the aim of my talk today is to help you understand those factors so that you fully understand which predictors are most important for shaping how Australians feel about climate change and how willing they are to act on it. When I talk about climate change beliefs and behaviour, we usually think about it in terms of these three separate but related constructs. So firstly, we have risk perception, or how much of a risk you think climate change is. So when we do our research, we use questions like, how likely do you think you are to experience serious threats to your well-being because of climate change? How serious would you rate the current impacts of climate change, and how often do you worry about the negative consequences? So risk perception is how bad a problem you think climate change is. Then we have behavioural willingness. So this is your willingness to implement the solutions that reduce the risk of climate change. So one such example is shifting to a more plant-based diet, which is the example I've used here because it's a nice picture to go with it. But behavioural willingness is also the willingness to advocate for a society that limits the amount of greenhouse gases that companies can produce. Your willingness to personally pay more for electricity if it means there are reduced emissions involved, willingness to donate to environmental groups, or willingness to vote in a way that is reliant on candidates' climate policies. And then lastly, we have actual behaviour. So this is, of course, whether you really do implement the solutions beyond just saying that you're willing to do so. So when you go out to eat, do you actually choose the vegetarian or vegan meal? On election day, did you actually vote for the party with the most progressive climate policy? I often see our goal in many cases as one in which we're trying to increase people's risk perception and their behavioural willingness in order to drive actual behaviour change. At the end of this talk, I'll talk a little bit about how sometimes we don't get there. So sometimes people are willing to change, but then they don't actually. But I still think it's a valuable goal to start with, one in which we're trying to increase people's awareness and their willingness to engage in change. So having said that, these are all the variables that have been identified as being the most important in shaping people's risk perception. So environmental psychology as a field has conducted many years of research in many different countries, and these are the variables that have showed up consistently as having the largest effects on how bad someone thinks climate change is. So in our research, which was that national survey, we verified that this was also true for an Australian sample. And we were also able to show that these factors also relate to behavioural willingness, so how willing people are to take action. So what I'll do now is I'll go through each of these factors in turn, explain what they are, and then describe how they relate to Australians' behavioural willingness. Firstly, we have demographics, which I actually won't explain because it's very straightforward. But what we found is that you're more likely to support climate action if you happen to be younger, female, and tend to vote progressive or liberal. I'm sure this doesn't surprise any one of us here. And at the same time, I'm not going to spend much time on this because in the grand scheme of things, the demographics aren't that important. And Philip was asking me before about religion. So I'll just make a quick point here that we also measured people's religious beliefs and their household income, but those two demographics were even less important than these age, gender, education, political party ones. Then we have cognitive variables. So cognitive because they relate to thought processes going on inside an individual's head. So the first is the amount of correct knowledge you have about climate change. So to what extent can you correctly identify the causes of climate change, the impacts of climate change, and the appropriate solutions to mitigate climate change? Then we have inefficacy, which is a mouthful, but it comes from efficacy, which is this social psychology term. Efficacy is the belief that firstly, I can perform an action, and secondly, that action will have an effect. So in the climate change context, inefficacy is this belief that we can't do anything about climate change. Even if we did, it wouldn't make a difference. So in our research, we measured people's inefficacy by seeing how much they agreed with statements like, we cannot take strong action on climate change now because other issues should take priority, or whatever behaviour we as a nation engage in will make no real difference. So we find that you're more likely to support climate action if you know more about climate change, but especially about appropriate solutions. So sort of knowing about the mechanics behind the causes of climate change is not that important. And also if you have lower levels of inefficacy, so you perceive action to be necessary and effective. Then we have experiential factors. So these relate to your sort of general experience with climate change. So the first is affect, which is broadly how you feel about climate change. And we find that you're more likely to support action if you feel very negatively about it. So you view it as something that is very unpleasant and very unfavorable. And you're also more likely to support action if you have had personal experience with extreme weather events. So like bushfires, floods, droughts. But the important thing here, the sort of second step, is that you have to link that extreme weather event with climate change. So I've been hearing anecdotal evidence that people who lost their homes in the bushfires don't think it's due to climate change, they think it's because of the Greens or because of arson. And so in that case, even if a house burns down because of an extreme weather event, they won't be any more concerned about climate change. The last group of factors are the socio-cultural factors. So these relate to influences from the outside world, whether that's sort of friends and family close to you or sort of the broader cultural systems in which we live. So the first are these social norms, which are the rules or guides for how to behave in a society. The descriptive social norms simply describe the extent to which important others are acting. And by important others, I mean people who you like and trust, like your friends, family, perhaps colleagues. So descriptive norms describe the extent to which friends, family, and colleagues are speaking to politicians, going to protests, changing the way they move around the country. Then we have prescriptive norms. So these are the extent to which those important others expect you to act. So how often do your friends encourage you to speak to politicians with them? How often do they ask you to come along on a strike with them, etc. Then we have three values that are thought to be most relevant to climate change. So the first are the biospheric values, which is the inherent value placed on the environment itself. Then we have altruistic values, which are those that prioritize equality and justice, whereas egoistic values are interested in pursuing self-serving activities like having authority and gaining power. Then we have free market ideology, which is a culturally formed belief, often, that markets should function without government intervention. So we measure that by asking people how much they agree with statements like an economic system based on free markets, unrestrained by government interference, automatically works best to meet human needs. So we find that you're more likely to support action if you perceive that others are acting and that others expect you to act. So social norms exist. If you have stronger biospheric and altruistic values, and if you have lower levels of free market ideology. So you think that markets can indeed function with government intervention. Okay, so now we know that all of these factors do affect how bad Australians think climate change is and how willing they are to do something about it. So I suspect that a lot of you already knew of these relationships. So in an ideal world, we'd sort of be ticking all these boxes off every time we talk about climate change. That's obviously not feasible. So what we were able to do in our study was quantify the relative importance of each of these factors. So see which of these were having the largest impact on people's beliefs and their willingness to act. And in sort of ranking the predictors, we can then talk about sort of which strategies might be most efficient or most effective. So thinking firstly about risk perception, so how bad Australians think climate change is, we found that the most important predictor was affect, or how unpleasant and unfavourable you perceive climate change to be. Second was inefficacy, so the extent to which you think action is unnecessary or ineffective. And then we have descriptive norms, so how much are the people around you already doing on climate change. So those are our top three. If we look to number 4 and 5, we then see a relatively important role of personal experience with extreme weather events and also with biospheric values. So now moving on to the most important predictors shaping Australians' willingness to act on climate change. Again, we see affect and inefficacy as being in the top 3. And this time we get prescriptive norms rather than descriptive norms. So the extent to which the people around you are encouraging you to act does actually influence your willingness to act more than just sort of passively observing what the people around you are doing. And again, if we look further down the list, we then see descriptive norms pop back up and biospheric values. And this time we also get a relatively important role of free market ideology. So you can see that there is a larger influence of socio-cultural factors here when it comes to willingness to act. Okay, so now how can we think about targeting these factors when we're talking about or discussing climate change? To target affect, we can try to use emotional stories and imagery. So use engaging language and relatable messages so that it leaves an impression on your listener. However, there is a possibility that by using too much emotion will create paralyzing climate anxiety or make a message so emotional so as to seem unreliable. So it's really important that we pair any emotional stories with a clear discussion of the solution. So always emphasize the feasibility of solutions. Either how cheap it is or how easy it is, and also convey why action is needed. So I know no one here is talking about how Australia is only 1.3% of global emissions. Instead, we can talk about how Australia is one of the highest emitters per capita in the world, and indeed the largest coal exporter in the world. When we frame our emissions in this way, it becomes much clearer why we need to take action now. To get at descriptive norms, we can make sure that any action we take is visible. By doing that, by telling our friends, family and colleagues, we can move from a society in which doing nothing about climate change is okay into one in which taking action is actually the socially accepted norm. And then to encourage prescriptive norms, just encourage your friends, family and colleagues to take action with you whenever you can. So now I'll go through 2 real-world examples where you can see these factors at play, either because they've been targeted or just sort of by happy coincidence. So the first is about climate strikes. And I find that going to a strike, reading the signs that kids have made, listening to their speeches, it makes it very clear why climate change is something that is unfavourable. The strikes are really good at combating inefficacy. So here we can think about the power of collective efficacy rather than just one individual's efficacy. So one person showing up in the city on a Friday afternoon with a sign probably isn't going to do much. But when you're surrounded by thousands of other people doing the same things, sharing the same values, your one action suddenly becomes much more effective, it's louder, it's more visible, and it achieves its goal sort of quicker. Then we had some really nice descriptive and prescriptive norms being reinforced before the strike. So prior to the strike, there was vocal support from various unions, some religious groups, lots of private businesses. So what this does is it tells a fairly broad cross-section of society that caring about climate change is okay, going to the strike is okay. In fact, if you do go, you'll be in the company of other people like you. So I think what these norms did was they encouraged more people to attend, therefore increasing collective efficacy, therefore reinforcing social norms and overall making the movement stronger and bigger. The next one is a bushfire example. So obviously many news outlets around the world reported on our recent bushfire crisis, often in quite negative and emotive ways. But fortunately, they often also provided the reader with a solution. In this case, a way to donate to the Port Macquarie Koala Hospital. So that affective image makes people concerned and worried, but by pairing it with a solution, we can address the source of that concern and worry. And it gives the readers this sense that I, in fact, can make a difference. And then on the GoFundMe page, there are quite clear descriptive and prescriptive norms visible. So you can see how many other people have donated, how much they've donated, and you can share this with trusted others. Okay, so hopefully now you understand that affect, inefficacy beliefs, and social norms can increase the levels of risk perception and behavioural willingness amongst Australians and sort of shift them further along this path towards actual behaviour. However, sometimes we don't get all the way there, and that's because there are often these two main obstacles to behaviour change. So the first is this perception of barriers to action, such as the perception that it's too expensive or too much effort. There may also be competing motives that make climate action seem implausible. So for example, I can't do anything about climate change now because I have bills to pay or I have kids to look after, or if you're a politician, have an economy to look after. So one way of getting around this is by sharing resources that people may be unaware of. So here I'm sort of thinking more about members of the community and not politicians. But for example, a financial resource might be subsidies for rooftop solar, and effort resources. An effort resource might be as simple as reminding people of the social network around them. So like friends or family who can babysit every now and then. And by bringing attention to these resources, we can sort of dispel the notion that climate action is something for full-time activists who have a lot of free time and a lot of disposable income. We can also talk about how climate action impacts those other very legitimate, supposedly competing motives. So for example, shifting away from fossil fuels to renewable energy isn't just good for some polar bear at the end of the world. There are other so-called co-benefits of climate action. So for example, shifting to renewable energy allows Australia to make technological progress. It allows us to improve our air quality and therefore the health of our children, and lower the cost of electricity bills. The second obstacle is one of low efficacy, which is the same as inefficacy. And I've already talked about some solutions before, such as always emphasizing the feasibility of solutions, making it clear why we need to take action. Another strategy here is about sharing wins. I know it often feels like there are not a lot of wins for us, but it's important that whenever there are, that we share them and we celebrate them to get rid of this idea that we can't make a difference. So these are just two examples I found sort of recently. And this other idea I want to touch back on is this idea of collective efficacy. So this image is from a recent study that I didn't do, but the researchers gave some participants this message that if one person reduced their TV usage, they could prevent 1.19 pounds of CO2 being released. They gave some other people this message that if 1,000 people reduced their TV usage, they could prevent 1,190 pounds of CO2 being released. So of course, the information in both frames is technically the same, But they found that that second 1,000 people frame was more persuasive and encouraged more action. So this sort of highlights the potential power of thinking about collective efficacy and results. Okay, this is my last slide. So the take home here is that we can increase people's risk perception and behavioural willingness by sharing emotional stories, emphasising the solutions and showing who is already acting. But to make that final leap into actual behaviour, we need to try our best to remove financial and effort barriers and increase people's sense of efficacy. That's it. Thank you.